Right now, there is a fundamental shift happening in the global economy. You don't always see it making front-page news, but hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign direct investment are quietly being redirected. For the last few decades, global supply chains had one primary anchor, and that was China. But recent trade data and corporate investments show a very clear pivot. Capital, manufacturing, and raw material processing are migrating. The destination is Southeast Asia. It is rapidly becoming a highly contested economic space where the United States and China are both trying to secure their economic futures. We are going to look at why this is happening, the actual data behind these supply chain moves, and the very real vulnerabilities these countries face in the process. I'm Daniel, and this is Asian Money Map. On this channel, we try to step back from the daily headlines to look at the macroeconomic facts, capital flows, and the data shaping the Asian region. We just want to understand where the markets are moving and why it matters. If that sounds useful to you, let's dive into it. To understand what is happening in Southeast Asia today, we first have to look at a corporate strategy you have probably heard of called China Plus One. A few years ago, following trade tensions and then the global supply chain disruptions of 2020, multinational corporations realized they had a vulnerability problem. Having almost all of their manufacturing concentrated in one country was incredibly efficient, but it lacked resilience. So, the idea was to maintain the primary base in China to serve the massive domestic market there, but build a secondary hub somewhere else, often in Southeast Asia, to export to the West. But if we actually look at the trade data, the narrative of decoupling, or the world completely moving away from China, is largely a myth. It is a lot more complicated than that. The reality is that supply chains aren't strictly relocating, they are lengthening. Yes, a Western tech company might move the final assembly of its laptops or smartphones to Vietnam. But if you look at where the internal components of those devices are coming from, a massive percentage are still manufactured in China. Southeast Asia's imports of intermediate goods from China have surged over the last 5 years. So, instead of shipping a finished product directly from Shenzhen to Los Angeles, the components are shipped from Shenzhen to Hanoi or Penang, assembled there, and then shipped to the US. And here is an even more interesting layer that often gets overlooked. Chinese companies are heavily participating in this migration. If you are a Chinese solar panel manufacturer or an electric vehicle maker facing heavy tariffs in North America or Europe, one logical workaround is to build a factory in Southeast Asia. By manufacturing and exporting from Thailand or Malaysia, Chinese firms can often legally navigate around those trade barriers. So, Southeast Asia isn't just a beneficiary of Western companies looking for alternatives, it is actively absorbing massive amounts of Chinese capital looking for neutral ground. It's a fascinating dynamic, but it places these nations in a very delicate position. Let's break down how this is playing out on the ground, starting with Vietnam. Vietnam is often cited as the biggest winner of the supply chain shift. Geographically, it borders China, making the logistics of moving components across the border relatively easy. Politically, the Vietnamese government has executed a very pragmatic foreign policy, which they refer to as bamboo diplomacy. The idea is to be solidly rooted in their own national interests, but flexible enough to maintain strong relationships with both Washington and Beijing. They recently upgraded their diplomatic ties with both superpowers within months of each other. Economically, the numbers are impressive. Foreign direct investment into Vietnam has been incredibly strong, particularly in electronics assembly. Major suppliers for Apple, Samsung, and other global brands have set up massive facilities in the northern provinces. But from an analytical standpoint, it is important to point out the very real ceiling Vietnam is hitting. Last summer, northern Vietnam experienced severe heat waves and droughts. Because the country relies heavily on hydropower, the drought severely impacted electricity generation. At the exact same time, demand for power was surging because of all these new factories. The result was rolling blackouts that forced major industrial parks to temporarily shut down. It highlighted a critical bottleneck: infrastructure. You can build all the factories you want, but if the power grid and the ports can't handle the load, the growth stops. Moving forward, Vietnam's biggest challenge isn't attracting capital. It is upgrading its infrastructure fast enough to actually use that capital effectively. Now, if we move a bit further south to Thailand, we see a completely different economic transition taking place. Thailand has historically been known as the Detroit of Asia. For decades, Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda built massive supply chains there for internal combustion engine vehicles. It is a highly developed, deeply integrated automotive hub, but the automotive industry is fundamentally changing, pivoting toward electric vehicles. And here, Thailand is trying to carefully manage a transition without destroying its legacy industry. The Thai government has rolled out aggressive subsidies and tax incentives to attract EV manufacturing, and it is largely Chinese companies like BYD, Great Wall Motors, and SAIC that have answered the call. They are pouring billions into Thai manufacturing plants. The analytical takeaway here is that Thailand is attempting to upgrade its industrial base, but it is a difficult balancing act. Domestic Thai auto parts suppliers, who spent decades making components for gasoline engines, are finding it incredibly hard to pivot to EVs, which require far fewer moving parts and rely on technology that is mostly imported from China. So, while the headline investment numbers in Thailand look great, the underlying local industry is facing a lot of pressure to adapt or risk being left behind in the transition. Next, let's look at Malaysia. Malaysia occupies a very specific, highly technical niche in this economic shift: semiconductors. When we talk about semiconductors, the conversation usually focuses on the cutting-edge fabs in Taiwan or the United States. But before a microchip can be put into a phone or a server, it has to be assembled, tested, and packaged. This is known as the ATP process. It is a critical part of the supply chain, and Malaysia, specifically the region of Penang, is a global powerhouse in this space. They currently hold roughly 13% of the global market share in semiconductor testing and packaging. What makes Malaysia's position interesting right now is that advanced packaging has become the new frontier in the chip industry. As it gets harder and harder to make individual transistors smaller, companies are focusing on stacking and packaging chips together to increase computing power. As U.S. export controls restrict certain technologies from going to China, both Western and Chinese tech firms are heavily investing in Malaysia's neutral ground to handle this back-end process. However, just like Vietnam's infrastructure bottleneck, Malaysia has a talent bottleneck. The country is facing a severe shortage of high-end engineers. A lot of Malaysian engineering talent ends up moving to neighboring Singapore for higher wages. If Malaysia wants to move up the value chain from just assembling chips to actually designing them, which is where the real money is, they have to figure out how to retain their domestic talent and heavily invest in technical education. It is not an easy problem to solve. Then, there is Indonesia. Indonesia's strategy has been arguably the most aggressive and controversial in the entire region. Indonesia happens to have the world's largest reserves of nickel, which is a crucial component in lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. Historically, Indonesia would mine the raw nickel ore and export it, mostly to China, where the high-value processing took place. But a few years ago, the Indonesian government made a very bold move. They completely banned the export of raw nickel ore. The message to the world was clear: if you want our nickel, you have to bring your capital, your technology, and your factories to Indonesia and build the smelters here. It was a massive gamble. The European Union challenged it at the World Trade Organization, and many analysts thought foreign companies would simply look for nickel elsewhere. But the gamble largely worked. Mostly Chinese companies, followed by Korean and Western firms, poured tens of billions of dollars into building processing facilities in Indonesia. It successfully forced the supply chain to move to them, creating a booming downstream industry. However, as an analyst, I have to point out the unintended consequences of this policy. The influx of investment led to a massive surge in Indonesian nickel production. So much so that it actually caused a global oversupply, which recently crashed global nickel prices. While this was great for EV manufacturers wanting cheaper batteries, it hurt mining operations globally and created significant economic volatility. Furthermore, the environmental impact of these massive industrial parks, heavily reliant on coal-fired power plants, has raised serious concerns. It is a perfect example of how complex these macroeconomic policies are. There is no such thing as a perfect win. There are only trade-offs. And while all this industrial growth is happening across these countries, Singapore continues to act as the financial and logistical control tower for the region. Capital tends to flow through Singapore before it is deployed into the factories of Vietnam or the mines of Indonesia. It remains the safe haven, the legal jurisdiction of choice, and the regional headquarters for most multinational operations. So, when we look at the entire region, the economic momentum is undeniably strong. But we have to remain objective and look at the broader, systemic risks. The first major risk is the geopolitical tug-of-war. Both the US and China are actively trying to pull Southeast Asia into their respective orbits. China offers the Belt and Road Initiative, massive infrastructure projects, railways, and deep-sea ports. It is very physical, tangible integration. The United States offers trade frameworks like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, security partnerships, and technology transfers. So far, Southeast Asian nations have managed to remain remarkably neutral. They gladly accept investment from both sides while avoiding formal alliances that would anger either superpower. But as the strategic competition intensifies, maintaining that neutrality is going to become increasingly difficult. If global trade fragments further into competing blocs, the pressure on these countries to choose a side will be immense. The second systemic risk is the middle income trap. This is a classic economic hurdle. It is relatively easy for a developing country to grow quickly by offering low wages and cheap land for foreign companies to set up assembly lines. But eventually, wages rise, and you are no longer the cheapest option. To keep growing and become a truly wealthy nation, a country has to transition from simply assembling things designed by other people to innovating, designing, and owning the intellectual property themselves. Right now, much of the growth in Southeast Asia is still driven by foreign companies utilizing the region as a manufacturing base. If these countries don't aggressively upgrade their education systems, improve their domestic infrastructure, and foster local innovation, they risk getting stuck. They could remain a permanent factory floor for the world without ever capturing the highest margins of the global supply chain. Finally, we cannot ignore the physical geography and the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. A massive percentage of global maritime trade passes through these waters. Several Southeast Asian nations have overlapping territorial claims with China. While business continues as usual for now, any escalation or miscalculation in these waters could disrupt the very shipping lanes that this entire economic boom relies upon. The geopolitical risk is priced into the region, but it remains a very fragile variable. When you put all of this data together, the picture that emerges is one of incredible opportunity mixed with significant growing pains. Southeast Asia is absolutely the new focal point of global manufacturing and trade restructuring. It is not just a trend, it is a structural realignment of how the world makes and ships things. But it is not a guaranteed straight line to prosperity. The countries that will truly succeed over the next decade will be the ones that can upgrade their infrastructure, educate their workforce, and carefully navigate the friction between Washington and Beijing without getting caught in the crossfire. I want to pass the question over to you, because there are a lot of different ways to look at this data. When you consider the risks like the middle income trap and infrastructure limits, which specific country in Southeast Asia do you think is actually implementing the most sustainable economic strategy for the long term? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I always learn a lot from reading your perspectives. If you appreciate a more objective, data-driven look at how capital and geopolitics are shifting across Asia, consider subscribing to the channel. We try to keep things grounded in reality so you can make sense of the actual trends. Thank you for your time. I'm Daniel. This is Asian Money Map, and I will see you in the next one.